Hey everyone, and welcome to today's Explainer. We've got a seriously fascinating one for you. We are putting on our historical economic researcher hats to investigate the macro data behind a literally massive 70-year transformation. The exact title for today's discussion is Composition and Direction of India's Foreign Trade.
That's right. We're going to be digging into the historical ledgers, the cargo manifests, the whole shebang. We're looking at the macroeconomic trends that chart India's evolution from a colonized territory straight into a global economic powerhouse. We're tracking exactly how India completely transformed its colonial trade identity over the decades. What they trade, who they trade with, and, how they actually physically move it across the globe.
So to really appreciate the data we're about to look at, we kind of need to establish a historical baseline first. Before 1947, the pattern of India's foreign trade was, strictly colonial. It was locked into this dynamic where it acted as a typical supplier of raw materials, mostly to industrialized nations, and specifically England.
Exactly. And on the flip side of that, it was forced to be an importer of manufactured goods. This was a devastating one-two punch. This forced dependence on foreign factories actively prevented domestic industrialization. And think about it. When a country is forced to buy simple, everyday goods from abroad, indigenous Indian handcrafts just suffer this severe, crushing blow. But as we roll into the post-1947 era, newly independent nations started viewing foreign trade differently, not as a trap, but actually as an engine for investment and growth.
Right, which brings us to our very first major data point. Look at how drastically that post-colonial strategy worked out. We're tracking a modern metric here that is just absolutely staggering, 48.8%. That number represents India's trade share in its gross national income during the 2016 to 2017 period. Yeah, and to put that into some historical context for you guys, back in 1990 to 1991, that share was only 17.55%. Then it grew to 25% by 2006, and then nearly doubled again to hit this 48.8% mark. I mean, we're not just talking about a slight increase in shipping here. This is a total paradigm shift. Almost half of the entire country's national income is now intricately tied to global imports and exports. The sheer volume and value of goods moving in and out of the country just multiplied several times over.
Okay, let's dive right into Section 1, Structural Shift in Trade.
So, a booming trade percentage is great and all, but as economic researchers, we know the real story always hides in the composition of that trade. Like, what exactly is sitting inside all those shipping containers? It's not just that India is trading more. It's that the very nature of what India buys and sells has undergone a complete metamorphosis since independence.
Let's start with the export side. Prior to independence, India's export identity was pretty much entirely defined by primary products, basic agricultural and mineral outputs. We're talking jute, cotton, tea, oilseeds, leather, food grains, that sort of thing.
But watch how that balance shifts. Over time, India moved way up the value chain. Today, the prime spots in India's export portfolio are taken up by high-value manufactured items. We're tracking massive outflows of ready-made garments, gems, jewelry, and crucially, electronic goods, especially computer hardware and software. Actually, by 2014 to 2015, gems and jewelry alone made up over 13% of India's merchandise exports. They literally evolved from selling the raw cotton to becoming one of the leading global exporters of ready-made garments. To put that in perspective, India went from exporting raw materials to directly stocking the shelves of the retail stores you and I shop in every day.
And that brilliantly illustrates the other side of the coin, the imports. Because just as the exports matured, the imports had to fundamentally change to fuel a growing industrial nation.
Precisely. Before independence, India was bringing in basic consumer goods, medicines, cloth, really simple electrical goods. But a developing industrial economy, it needs fuel, it needs infrastructure. So we see this massive transition to heavily buying capital goods. India is now aggressively importing high-tech machinery, chemicals, fertilizers, steel, and of course petroleum. Petroleum has actually remained the single most critical import item, hovering right around 31% of total imports. This is the absolute hallmark of a country that is aggressively industrializing and building things, not just consuming them. These numbers, they directly represent the fuel in your cars and the tech sitting on your desks.
So we figured out what is moving, but our next investigation requires us to figure out where exactly it's all going. Right, the direction of foreign trade. By that we mean the specific destinations of our exports and the sources of our imports. Now remember, prior to 1947, Britain held a strict monopoly. They held the #1 position in India's foreign trade. But independence meant the ability to forge new bonds. So who is India trading with now? As we track down these new global partners, the data reveals a completely redrawn map.
When we open up the ledgers today, a completely different group of economic heavyweights emerges.
Since liberalization in 1991, India's geographical trade composition has just expanded manifold. The USA has actually emerged as the leading trading partner.
Yep, and closely following the US, we have some major industrial powers, Germany, Japan, and the United Kingdom. It is absolutely fascinating to see the UK still on the board, but now, as an equal partner rather than a colonial monopolizer. Building this diverse portfolio of top-tier economic partners brings a ton of reputation and goodwill to India in the international market, which for sure ensures a high standard of competitive trade.
Let's crunch some specific numbers from the 2016-2017 data to see how this breaks down regionally. Because when we look at the direction of India's exports, it's not just about the numbers themselves, it's about the strategic insight this data gives us.
And the biggest insight here is absolutely diversification. Developing nations now represent the largest single bloc, taking in 43.5% of India's exports. This points to incredibly strong, growing South-South trade relations and strategic regional partnerships. Right behind them, we have the OECD countries, which are essentially the world's highly developed economies, taking in 37.9%. Meanwhile, OPEC nations account for 16.4%. So what this proves is that India isn't just relying on one wealthy nation or one specific region anymore. They have heavily diversified their export destinations across both the developing and the developed worlds.
All right, moving right along to Section 2, Oceanic Logistics and New Ports.
Because as economic historians, we literally cannot ignore the physical logistics here. Trade is just a concept on paper until you actually load a container onto a vessel. To sustain this massive trade boom over the last 70 years, India had to completely revolutionize its physical infrastructure, which brings us to this absolutely pivotal statistic, 68%. Even with the massive modern rise of air freight, a whopping 68% of all of India's foreign trade relies entirely on oceanic routes. Most of India's global exchange, and that even includes trade relations with neighboring countries like Sri Lanka and Myanmar, happens by sea. You have to realize the sheer weight of petroleum imports, iron ore, and outgoing engineering machinery. It demands incredibly robust maritime logistics.
But here was the historical bottleneck. For its early foreign trade, India depended almost entirely on traditional colonial-era ports. Specifically, we're talking about Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai.
Right, so imagine taking that massive 48.8% gross national income trade volume we talked about earlier, and trying to funnel the whole thing entirely through infrastructure built back in the early 1900s. It is a recipe for disaster. Those three original ports became incredibly overburdened. It's literally like trying to force a 6-lane highway's worth of traffic onto a single dirt road. A rapidly scaling industrial economy simply cannot afford to have its vital capital imports and its lucrative exports sitting there stuck in a catastrophic harbor traffic jam.
Which leads us to the modern solution. To relieve that extreme pressure on Mumbai, Kolkata, and Chennai, India executed a massive maritime infrastructure expansion. They didn't just build a few extra docks. They built these massive pressure release valves that quite literally saved the booming trade economy from choking on its own success.
Exactly. They developed advanced, brand-new port centers all across the coastline. We saw the rise of Kandla in the west, Cochin in the south, Vishakhapatnam on the eastern coast, and Nhava Sheva is also known as Jawaharlal Nehru Port, and it was specifically built to take the massive container load off the traditional Mumbai port. These new logistical hubs are the physical arteries that keep the modern cargo moving smoothly. They are what allows that 68% of oceanic trade to actually flow efficiently out to the USA, Germany, Japan, and the rest of the world.
It really is just a masterful case study in macroeconomics. I mean, we've seen a nation transition from an exploited supplier of raw materials to a fully diversified global trader. They shifted their goods from raw jute to complex computer software and redirected their ships from a single colonial power to a vast network of both developing and developed nations.
It is a totally remarkable 70-year timeline. But, the data never stops moving. As we look at these newly developed ports and the ever-shifting global demand, it leaves us with one final, kind of provocative question to think about. As India's exploding global identity continues to scale, what new infrastructure, both physical and digital, will it take to power the next 70 years of economic evolution?
Well, we hope this deep dive into the macro data has given you a fresh perspective on the mechanics of global trade. Keep analyzing that data, and we'll see you in the next explainer.